Hey guys, so before we get into today's video, I want to give a shout out to my boys on YouTube known as the Midnight Mormons. As you may know, I am a friend of the Midnight Mormon show, and with good reason. Carden.
Whew, good thing women don't have the priesthood in our faith, because you would be a handful in the quorum of the 12. Oh! Oh!
Brad.
Obedience is the first principle of heaven, and Gen Z and millennials have not been taught obedience well.
And Kwaku.
You will not win, do you understand me? You will not win, you scum! I will eat you! I'll eat my neighbors.
Are some of the funniest and most down-to-earth faithful saints online today. The show approaches Latter-day Saint culture, doctrine, and current events in ways that break the stuffy boomer mold. Check them out and subscribe. You won't regret it.
So at the end of the day, I want to be evidence-based. Whatever the results are, we ought to give weight to them. If things lead to people having less healthy outcomes, then we ought to trust the evidence and make shifts in our society based on that.
Okay, can we go to slide number 4 on my slideshow? So one of the things that is interesting is you know you're helping people to deconstruct their faith, and you know most of the time this is resulting in atheism. And according to the research, first of all, atheists are significantly less happy and have worse outcomes than religious individuals. Like here it talks about in Pew, it says in the US, for instance, 36% of actively religious people describe themselves as very happy, compared with 25% of the inactively religious and 25% of the unaffiliated. Notable happiness gaps among these groups also exist in Japan, Australia, and Germany. And anyone who's watching, it's a very known thing that levels of life satisfaction for religious individuals are higher than for those with atheism. And then in the US, at least, amongst the religious groups in the United States, Jews and Mormons have the highest well-being of any faith groups examined in the analysis done by Gallup. Okay. And people with no religious identity tend to have the lowest overall well-being. So if you're leading people to deconstruction, Bill, and towards atheism, are you actually leading them towards a better outcome? The science and the data would seem to suggest otherwise. And that's something that, there's a lot of people out there, even atheists, who say, look, I'm not going to really mess with people's religion because at the end of the day, it helps provide social cohesion. It's a useful technology, as you had said. So I'm not going to mess with it. I'm not going to go out there and tell people to deconstruct. And in this case in particular, according to the research, not only are you attacking religious belief, you're attacking the religion in the United States that seems to be producing the highest levels of well-being of any religious group. And so it's like, man, Bill, if there's a target to going after the Mormons who tend to produce so much good outcomes for people, by the data, it's like, man, and I'm not saying that there aren't things that maybe could be critiqued here and there and things where we go off the rails, and I'll critique things that we do as a people, and we're not perfect, but like this overall thing that Mormonism is unhealthy when Mormonism produces the highest well-being of any faith group, it's kind of like, whoa, like, is this the right target? Oh, you're muted, Bill. You're muted. Oh, there you go.
Yeah, no sweat. So the trouble is you're splitting people into these groups here, and there's a lot of other reasons for why. And the other thing too is go back to the original framing. How many of these folks actually did deconstruction? You're putting deconstruction effects at the top. That's not really what's going on. You're taking people who go to church, believe in God, versus people who don't go to church but believe in God, versus people who don't go to church and don't believe in God. And those three groups can be split into lots of different categories. And I would argue that folks who spend the time to deconstruct their religious system, namely Mormonism, because that's the one I have experience in. We did a survey down here in Southern Utah where we asked folks who had deconstructed Mormonism whether they were happier or not. And it was like 93% reported being as happy or happier than when they were believing. But I think the same problem occurs with that data that occurs with yours, which is that Mormons are taught to present themselves as happy. And to some degree, my wife and I would tell you that there were times 10 or 15 years ago, we were all in, that if you asked us if we were happy, we would have said yes. But now, only getting to the other side of things, do I realize the harm that was being done to me and the trauma that was being handed out. And so Mormons tend to want to present themselves as happy, because how do we get our neighbors to join the church if we're not? How do we, when we go to church, I put a white shirt and tie on, my wife puts a dress on, we go sit in the pew and we all hold each other and smile. But the reality is that there are really difficult things going on. And Mormonism rarely gives a place for those Mormonism rarely gives a place for those vulnerable conversations to occur. And we're often faking to some degree, because we need to present to all the non-members and to those around us. It's called costly signaling. So if Mormonism's working for me, there's a psychological phenomenon where high demand religions require constant costly signaling, meaning that I had to expend some sort of effort wearing garments, not drinking coffee, not drinking tea, not doing things the way the world would do them. I'm signaling to those around me that I fit in, that I'm a Mormon as well as anyone else. And it leads to certainly the possibility that when folks go to the Gallup poll and answer questions, that they feel an internal need to frame Mormonism as happier than it is. And until they actually go through a faith crisis, they may not even comprehend the damage that's being done to them in a patriarchy with unhealthy, say, boundaries around children and adults. And again, list could go on and on. It is very likely that until one gets to the other side, they couldn't even have seen it until then anyway. So I don't like this kind of data, because there's so much going on here, and it's easy to say like, I win, you lose, but that's not really what it's telling.
And the thing is I'm just curious about, what does the data say about those outcomes? And to your, let me kind of steel man some things here. So one thing that you're saying is that, Latter-day Saints might kind of overstate how happy they actually are because they need to do that, right?
And deconstructed Mormons might do the same.
And fair enough. My thing is, but then you can also look at objective metrics for well-being, things like health,
like depression and antidepressant drugs, and the rate of sexual abuse in a community.
Well, let's talk about a few of those. So, but first of all, and I'll address some of those. So, like from a health perspective, right? Like Latter-day Saints live significantly longer than is
longer better?
7.1 years longer when it comes to health than other groups. Kind of the national average.
Is longer better?
Yes, I think living a long life is better. Okay. I would say.
Maybe. Okay.
The other thing is that when it comes to kind of community and social relationships, the number of volunteer hours that are given that church members do is basically on par with the national average, not including all of the church service. So they do all, which is like, it's way higher. Like, I can't remember the exact data that I saw on it, but it's significantly higher than the national average if you include the church service. And if you take away the church service, it's basically on par. And that is, those kind of social giving and social involvement in their community is something that Latter-day Saints are well known for. Okay. And then you have, on top of that, we could go to the metric of financial stability, right? Like, this isn't something you can just fake. Latter-day Saints are more likely than the general population to be in the middle class than to be in lower income levels. They're, when it comes to education, Latter-day Saints actually have been shown, which is contrary to other groups, the more education you have in other faiths oftentimes leads to lower levels of religiosity, where in the church, you're actually more likely to be, the more education you have, the more likely you are to be active in the church. And then when it comes to things like suicide and like depression rates, all that kind of stuff. So one thing that Latter-day Saints do that they don't take into the data is the fact that Latter-day Saints don't self-medicate. So if we're not drinking, for instance, we're more likely to actually go and get a prescription for our depression, where a lot of people just turn to alcohol to treat their depression.
But the church is the one who gives that rule out. So it seems like you're arguing that people might be better. They might be less depressed if they were allowed to drink alcohol. But the other side of the coin
No,
is that as a Mormon, you can't drink alcohol.
No, that's not. Just to be clear on what my argument is, I'm saying that other people self-medicate instead of
Right.
going to see a doctor to actually get a prescription for something. So there's a lot of depressed people out there that aren't going to a doctor and actually getting any kind of medication to help them with their depression. They just turn to alcohol. And that, I don't think that's, I mean, do you think it's a healthy behavior to turn to alcohol to treat your depression?
No, but nor is it a healthy behavior to have as your only option opiates and a lot of the prescription drugs that are available.
Well, and
for
I
these
hope
things,
I
too.
hope that isn't seen as the only option by people. And then in addition to that, you have, I mean, we all know that postpartum
By the way, I
depression.
self-medicate. I use cannabis regularly, and I'm a huge fan of what that does for me.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah.
So what another thing is that Latter-day Saint women tend to have more children, and postpartum depression is just, if you have two populations and one of them is having more babies than the other population, you're likely to have higher rates of postpartum depression simply because of the numbers, right? And postpartum depression isn't anyone's fault. It's just something that happens with pregnancy. And so would you expect for a population that's having more children to have the same levels of postpartum depression and the medications that go along with that as a population that doesn't?
Who's encouraging them to have lots of children?
Well, I think the church encourages people to have children, as many as they can. That children are seen as a blessing, and Latter-day Saints are encouraged to have children, and I think that's a great thing. I have 4 kids, and I wouldn't give them up.
I think, totally. I hear you say that, but I would also want to stand behind every person's individual right to decide how many children they have without any peer pressure from the religious system telling them to multiply and replenish the earth. And hence, lots of people would have made a very different decision about how many children they had, and perhaps maybe would have suffered less depression. Now, again, the whole thing
Well,
is,
if I've never heard someone say, "Man, I wish I didn't have that last child that I have." They really are a drag
I wish I
on
would
my
have not
life.
had any children because I wasn't equipped to do it. I was a horrible dad at times and a horrible husband at times because I was overstressed by the number of kids. Again, I love all 4 of my children. They're amazing. I can't trade it back.
You do wish that you didn't have them.
If you go back in time, Jacob, and you make different choices, you have no idea what the outcome of those choices are, right? Like, you're living in a different reality. What I'm saying is that my kids incurred a ton of trauma because I wasn't equipped to be a dad of 4 kids that were back to back to back to back.
Uh-huh.
And the harm that I did to them and the harm that I did to myself, it might have been better if I would not have had kids at all. I wasn't equipped for it.
I personally am glad that your kids are here, and I'm glad that my kids are here. And frankly, and I will say, I'm not a perfect parent, and we all mess up, but I believe that life is worth it. And I believe that we can learn through these things, and we can come.
Life is worth
together.
it for some human beings. Some human beings live in absolute misery. Some human beings live in, you get to go like, oh, like 97% of people are good. So let's bring 100 people in, and let's not worry about the 3 that are, bedridden or have difficulties and challenges, that they're miserable. I just think the human experience is really messy. And I'm not a big fan. I'm not a big fan of just saying like, hey, here's my experience, and hence everyone else should go in line with.
Well, and the church's official stance is that it is up to the couple to decide how many children they can have. But children,
a lot of pressure. Well, it was a lot of pressure.
There is a culture that values children and to have a family, and I don't necessarily see that as a problem if we want to continue our human civilization. You have to have at least you have to have more than 2 children per couple in order to continue the human population and to continue the human race. If you don't, the human race, I mean, it's just math. Like, if you're only having 1 child per couple, we eventually go extinct.
No, but we could diminish it for a long time and the planet would be better off. Like, I remember thinking I had if I told my wife I was having a crisis, that there was a 50% chance she would leave me just because of that reason.
So do you think it's wise to deconstruct people's faith if their marriages might fall apart?
I think it's wise to give people truth and information and let people make the best decisions they can.
Even if that
again,
leads, even if that leads to bad outcomes, even if it leads to suicide and depression and all that kind of stuff. I mean,
yeah, you're isolating one.
And I'm not,
thing
and
away
just
from all
just
the
you know,
others.
I'm not necessarily disagreeing with you. I actually am a believer that people need to be told the truth, because I believe the truth exists, one, and two, I believe it's worth knowing. And so I'm not a pure pragmatist when it comes to the truth.
Even if it's not true, even if the church isn't true, you would agree that truth is worth knowing.
Yes.
Okay, then I don't want you to fight me on it, because we agree.
But
you also agree that people should have truth even if it hurts.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, I will caveat that though, right? So this is a tricky topic, and I'll full on admit that I'm still trying to sort it out myself, right? Because I believe in, for instance, there's the classic problem of your wife asks you if she looks fat in that dress, and you know she's dealing with really severe body issues and depression. Do you give the brutal truth, or do you realize that truth given without context can actually be harmful? And the context in this case with my wife is that she truly is beautiful. She's loved, she's valuable, all that kind of stuff. And so if I give her the hard truth about my opinion that she doesn't look good in that dress, it may have bad consequences. So I may omit the truth because that person isn't ready to process that information, because they don't have the full context or understanding to be able to handle it. They don't have the full story, as it were. And until you have the full story, certain aspects of a story, if given in isolation, can irk you out. Like my wife feeling terrible about herself because she doesn't realize that I think that she's beautiful and she's valuable no matter what, right? So it's a complicated topic, but
Who gets to determine when you're honest with somebody and when you're not?
Each one of
us.
Who created that? Well, it's not dishonest to decide that certain information needs to be understood before other information needs to be understood, right? Because you can confuse someone. Like if I went up to a 5-year-old and I began to talk to them about trigonometry, they might freak out and think I'm crazy because they don't understand the other things that actually make this complex equation make sense, right? So information needs to be built line upon line. Otherwise, and we all do this.
And it's subjective though. It's very subjective.
Yes, but I would say that there is an objective standard by which we can tell if what we're doing is good or bad. Yeah. So do you enjoy the content here on Thoughtful Faith? If so, be sure to hit the notification bell. This ensures that our new videos show up on your feed. Also, be sure to check out our Facebook group called Thoughtful Saints, where myself and others discuss the sorts of topics found on this channel. And lastly, if you think other people would benefit from this video, please be sure to share it.